Welcome to Tickle versus Giggle, behavioural-constitutional analysis. A fork in the road for Australia in terms of how institutions has allowed the mask to slip closer to authoritarianism and such. Episode 8, when the system started defining reality faster than people could resist it. The overhead digital display refreshes again. Suspicious behaviour can be reported anonymously through the public safety portal. Passengers barely react anymore. Heads remain lowered toward illuminated screens while reflections flicker across exhausted faces travelling home through the darkened city. The country still outwardly functions, but underneath ordinary Australian life, another process has accelerated beyond quiet institutional drift. Administrative reality reconstruction is moving faster than the population can psychologically metabolize or publicly resist it. That is the deeper escalation emerging beneath the Tickle versus Giggle conflict. The issue is no longer merely legal misinterpretation, semantic instability, or institutional overreach. The issue is institutional systems progressively acquiring enough behavioural authority to redefine foundational categories faster than ordinary people can emotionally stabilise against them. That is where the constitutional pressure intensifies, because constitutional civilization originally assumed stable reality categories were necessary for coherent law, coherent language, coherent protection, and coherent restraint against arbitrary power. Once categories become permanently administratively fluid, the population gradually loses stable ground beneath psychological orientation itself. And populations without stable orientation become behaviourally easier to manage. Not because people become evil, because exhaustion slowly replaces resistance. The employee slowly learns career preservation increasingly depends less upon stable truth recognition and more upon anticipatory behavioural adaptation. Across the country, people increasingly adapt by lowering confrontation, reducing clarity expectations, and suppressing confusion, and continuing daily routines while privately sensing something foundationally no longer feels stable underneath the language itself. And that adaptation matters, viewers, because when institutional systems redefine reality continuously, citizens eventually reorganize psychologically around uncertain management rather than truth recognition. And once uncertainty becomes normalized long enough, constitutional restraint itself weakens. Not immediately, gradually, because constitutional order depends upon shared definitions stable enough for ordinary people to recognize when power exceeds its proper boundaries, when the institution exceeds its proper boundaries, as in the case of Tickle versus Giggle. And if boundaries themselves become permanently adjustable through administrative reinterpretation, public resistance becomes increasingly difficult to organise coherently. The system no longer requires overt force at every stage. Behavioural fatigue begins carrying part of the burden automatically. And that's where the emotional atmosphere surrounding the Tickle versus Giggle crisis conflict feels far larger than the case itself, and that it is. This will change the nation of Australia downward on its trajectory toward third world status. Many Australians instinctively recognise the deeper fear underneath the legal arguments. If institutions can redefine foundational human categories rapidly enough, then ordinary people can eventually lose confidence in their own ability to distinguish stable truth from managed interpretation altogether. And once populations stop trusting their own recognition capacity, dependency upon institutional guidance quietly deepens. The country outwardly appears calm, trains still arrive, offices still open, schools still operate, but underneath the procedural normality, another question slowly expands across the nation, its psychological landscape. What happens to constitutional civilization once reality itself becomes administratively negotiable faster than human beings can emotionally resist it? Because eventually the issue is no longer merely what institutions are redefining. The issue becomes whether the population still possesses enough internal stability left to recognise the redefinition while it's happening.